What if everything you've been told about yourself is wrong? You've been called too sensitive, overthinking, difficult. Society whispers that you need fixing, that your intensity is exhausting, that your questions are uncomfortable, that your depth makes others uneasy. But here's what they don't tell you. You're not broken. You're rare. Dr. Carl Jung spent 60 years studying minds like yours. His conclusion? Those very traits that make you feel like an outsider are actually the hallmarks of psychological evolution. You don't think differently because something's wrong with you. You think differently because you're operating at a level most humans never reach. Only 2% of the population possesses what Jung called differentiated consciousness. If you've always felt like you don't belong, there's a reason. You don't belong to the ordinary. You belong to something extraordinary. These 8 signs will prove it. Here's what most people don't understand about psychological evolution. It's not gradual. It's revolutionary. And some minds are simply wired to operate at levels that others cannot access. Dr. Jung discovered that traditional psychology had been studying the wrong thing entirely. Instead of focusing on mental illness, he studied mental excellence. What he found changed everything we thought we knew about human consciousness. Through decades of research, Jung identified specific neural patterns that create what he called psychological sophistication. These aren't learned behaviors. They're hardwired traits that manifest consistently across cultures, backgrounds, and generations. But here's the shocking part. These very traits that indicate advanced consciousness are the same ones society teaches us to suppress. Jung's research revealed something extraordinary. Every single person who possessed these 8 characteristics showed remarkable resilience, creativity, and the ability to catalyze transformation in others. Yet almost all of them believed something was wrong with them. The tragedy isn't that you're different. The tragedy is that you've been convinced your differences are defects. Today, we examine Jung's 8 markers of advanced consciousness. Not to label you, but to liberate you from the myth that normal is the goal. Because what if normal was never meant to be your destination? Sign 1. You experience emotional depth that others simply cannot fathom. Dr. Carl Jung discovered something rather remarkable about emotional intensity. He found that certain individuals don't merely feel emotions. They experience what he termed affect-toned complexes that create profound psychological resonance. Put simply, you don't simply have feelings. Feelings move through you like ocean currents, deep and utterly transformative. Here's what Jung recognized and what most people utterly miss. This isn't emotional instability. It's emotional sophistication. But why does society attempt to convince you otherwise? When you feel deeply, you're not overreacting. You're accessing layers of psychological experience that most people have learned to suppress. Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Your emotional intensity isn't a burden. It's a form of psychological radar that recognizes what others cannot see. You feel the unspoken tension in rooms. You sense when someone's smile doesn't match their eyes. You carry the emotional undercurrents of every interaction because your psyche is wired for depth, not superficial pleasantries. But here's where it gets interesting. And here's where most people with this trait make a critical mistake that keeps them trapped. Jung identified a specific pattern of how emotionally deep people sabotage their own gift. The world tells you to tone it down, be more reasonable, stop making everything so dramatic. But Jung understood that when you suppress this emotional depth, you don't become normal. You become neurotic. You begin to experience what he called psychological splitting, where part of you knows the truth, whilst another part tries to conform. That's why you've probably felt exhausted trying to be someone you're not. Like Maya, who spent her whole life believing she was too much, too intense, too emotional, too deep, only to discover later that she wasn't broken. She was simply ahead of her time. Her emotions weren't flaws. They were signals, guides leading her towards something extraordinary. Sign 2. You question everything with relentless curiosity. According to Dr. Carl Jung, most people live what he called unconscious lives. They accept societal programming without examination. But you can't help but dig deeper. Jung would have recognized you as someone with an active thinking function that refuses to accept superficial explanations. Here's what's crucial. Jung discovered that people who question everything aren't difficult. They're psychologically honest. But this honesty has a hidden price that most people don't recognize until it's too late. You don't just ask what. You ask why. Why do people stay in relationships that make them unhappy? Why do we accept systems that don't serve us? Why do we pretend superficial conversations are meaningful connections? Your mind constantly seeks truth beneath appearances. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psychological ability to see beyond present limitations. Whilst others accept the status quo, you're already envisioning what could be different, what could be better, what could be more authentic. But here's the paradox Jung identified. The clearer you see, the more isolated you can become. Why? Because your questions threaten other people's comfortable illusions. When you ask deep questions, you're not just seeking answers. You're challenging the psychological defense mechanisms that help people feel safe in their limitations. That's why you've probably been called cynical or negative, even though you're actually courageously honest. Jung discovered something fascinating about people like you. You have what he called prophetic consciousness. You see where things are heading before others do. Sign 3. You've developed fierce independence as psychological survival. Dr. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." You've learned to do exactly that, not from choice, but from necessity. According to Jung's research, people with rare personalities often develop what he called individuated consciousness earlier than others, usually through adversity. Here's what Jung understood, and what most therapists miss. Your independence isn't a defense mechanism. It's an achievement. But society will try to convince you it's a problem. You've learned through painful experience that depending on others for your self-worth is psychological quicksand. So you built yourself up. You stood up, often alone, and created an identity that couldn't be taken away by another's opinion or absence. Jung called this process individuation, the psychological journey toward wholeness. Most people never complete this journey because it requires facing what Jung called the shadow, all those parts of yourself you were taught to reject. But here's where it gets complex. Your independence attracts people who want to possess it and repels people who feel threatened by it. Jung identified a specific pattern of how independent personalities navigate relationships. And understanding this pattern changes everything. You don't need anyone to complete you because you've done the psychological work to become whole. This means you don't seek relationships from desperation. You seek them from choice. You don't want someone to save you. You want someone to stand beside you whilst you both continue to grow. Your solitude isn't abandonment. It's a sanctuary. It's the place where you remember who you are beneath all the roles and expectations. And that's self-knowledge. Jung said it's the foundation of all psychological health. Sign 4. You possess intuitive awareness that borders on clairvoyance. Dr. Carl Jung revolutionized psychology when he identified intuition as a legitimate psychological function. He said, Intuition is perception through the unconscious that brings forth ideas, images, possibilities, ways out of a blocked situation by a process that is mostly unconscious. Here's what Jung discovered, and what science is only now proving. Some people have nervous systems programmed to pick up information that others completely miss. But this gift comes with a burden that can destroy relationships if you don't understand how to handle it. You don't just observe people, you read their psychological state. You notice the micro-expressions, the energy shifts, the words they don't say. Jung would have recognized this as evidence of what he called active imagination, the ability to perceive beyond the obvious. When someone says they're fine, but their body language screams desperation, you can't unsee it. When there's tension in a room that everyone else seems to ignore, you feel it in your bones. This isn't paranoia. This is psychological sensitivity operating at a high level. But here's Jung's warning. If you don't learn to protect this sensitivity, it will exhaust you. He identified a specific technique that allows intuitive people to maintain their awareness without absorbing everyone else's psychological chaos. According to Jung, people with strong intuitive function often become unconscious therapists. They take on emotional labor for everyone around them. You regulate conversations, diffuse tensions, and carry unspoken pain because you can't help but perceive it. The danger is that you become so skilled at reading others that you forget to check in with yourself. You become externally focused, constantly scanning for emotional data, whilst your own needs remain unmet and unexpressed. Sign 5. You crave meaning over social acceptance. Dr. Carl Jung observed, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you truly are." But what if being true to yourself means rejecting everything society tells you you should want? Jung discovered that certain personalities are psychologically incapable of living inauthentic lives. Here's what Jung recognized about people like you. You don't choose meaning over popularity. Your psyche demands it. But this creates a specific type of psychological conflict that can be devastating if you don't understand what's happening. You've probably tried to live for external validation. Maybe you followed the script, said the right things, played the expected role. But Jung would have recognized the symptoms immediately. That gnawing emptiness, that sense of betraying something essential, that quiet desperation beneath the applause. According to Jung, when you live against your psychological type, you don't just develop discomfort, you develop what he called neurotic symptoms. Your psyche literally rebels against inauthenticity. You can't pretend superficial goals matter. You can't get excited about achievements that have no substance. You can't build relationships based on convenience rather than connection. Your psychological makeup doesn't allow it. That's why you've probably felt like an alien in your own culture. But Jung identified something remarkable about people who prioritize meaning. They become evolutionary catalysts for human consciousness. When you refuse to settle for less than authentic connection, you force others to confront their own inauthenticity. When you ask the questions others avoid, you create space for truth. When you live by your values rather than your fears, you give others permission to do the same. Sign 6. You've outgrown people and environments that once fit. Dr. Carl Jung said, "The greatest tragedy of the family are the unlived lives of the parents." But what happens when you refuse to live an unlived life? What happens when you outgrow the psychological limitations of your environment? Jung discovered something profound about psychological growth. It's often a lonely journey, but there's a specific type of grief that comes with evolution, and understanding this grief is crucial for your continued development. You've probably experienced the painful realization that people who once knew you no longer do, not because you've become difficult or superior, but because you've shed layers of conditioning that no longer serve you. Jung called this process psychological death and rebirth. Here's what most people don't understand about outgrowing relationships. It's not a decision you make. It's a consequence of becoming authentic. The friends who knew you when you made yourself smaller, when you wanted to please people, when you suppressed your truth, they remember that version of you. And sometimes they want that version back because it felt safer, more predictable, easier to understand. But you can't go back. Jung understood that psychological evolution is irreversible. Once you've looked behind the curtain of societal conditioning, once you've tasted authentic living, you can't return to unconscious conformity. Jung made a shocking observation about people who outgrow their environments. They often experience what he called the dark night of the soul, a period of profound loneliness that tests their commitment to authenticity. This isn't ordinary loneliness. It's existential isolation, the recognition that your path is unique, that your perspective is rare, that your growth might mean leaving everything familiar behind. But Jung discovered something beautiful about people who successfully navigate this transition. They attract relationships of extraordinary depth and authenticity. Sign 7. You offer profound presence in a distracted world. According to Dr. Carl Jung, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there's any reaction, both are transformed. But what if you're the kind of person who creates transformation simply by showing up authentically? Jung identified a rare quality that some people possess, the ability to create what he called psychological holding space. If you have this gift, you already know how much it costs you, but you might not recognize how rare and valuable it truly is. When someone talks to you, they feel seen in a way that's unusual. You don't just hear their words. You perceive their underlying emotional state. You don't offer quick fixes. You offer deep witnessing. You don't rush to judgment. You create space for truth to emerge. Jung understood that this level of presence is actually a form of psychological healing. In your company, people remember what it feels like to be human, complex, contradictory, worthy of understanding. But here's Jung's crucial insight. People with this gift often exhaust themselves by giving it too freely. He identified specific psychological boundaries that allow empathetic people to maintain their depth without depleting themselves. You've probably found yourself in the role of unofficial therapist, emotional anchor, or safe harbor for others. Whilst this makes you invaluable, it can also make you invisible. You become so skilled at holding space for others that you forget to ask for space to be held for you. The work isn't to stop caring or close your heart. The work is to learn discernment, to understand who deserves access to your emotional presence and who has earned the right to reciprocate. Sign 8. You sense a greater purpose you can't yet define. Dr. Carl Jung said, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." If you've felt a persistent sense that you're meant for something more than the ordinary, Jung would have recognized this as what he called the transcendent function, your psyche's drive toward individuation and purpose. Here's what Jung discovered about people with undefined but urgent purpose. They're not delusional or grandiose. They're responding to what he called archetypal calling. You felt it. That restless knowing that you have something to contribute, something to build, something to say. It might not be clear yet, but it's undeniable. Jung understood this as evidence of what he called creative potential seeking expression. This isn't about fame or recognition. It's about alignment, the psychological necessity of living in harmony with your deepest nature. Jung found that people who ignore this calling often develop what he called neurotic symptoms, anxiety, depression, a sense of meaninglessness. But here's Jung's most profound insight about purpose-driven personalities. Your calling isn't just personal, it's transpersonal. You're not just here to fulfill yourself. You're here to serve the evolution of consciousness itself. Jung believed that individuals with rare personalities serve as bridges between the unconscious and conscious realms of human experience. Through your depth, your questioning, your refusal to accept superficial answers, you help humanity grow. That's why you can't settle for the ordinary. That's why superficial connections feel empty. That's why you'd rather be alone than pretend. Your psyche knows you have work to do, and this work requires authenticity, depth, and courage. You were never the problem. You were always the solution. There's a reason you've stayed with this message until the very end. There's a reason these truths resonate in the deepest chambers of your soul. You recognize yourself. For years, they told you to shrink, to dim your light, to apologize for your intensity. But now you understand the truth. You are not the anomaly. You are the evolution. You are among those who refuse to sleepwalk through existence, who choose depth over comfort, who demand meaning over acceptance, who see what others cannot bear to witness. Your sensitivity isn't your weakness, it's your superpower. Your questions aren't disruptions, they're revolutions. Your solitude isn't isolation, it's sanctuary. The world doesn't need another copy. It needs the original that is you. Every great leap in human consciousness has come not from those who conform, but from the rare souls who dare to be authentic, who refuse to accept that's just how things are, who insist on living by their deepest truths. You've lived believing you were too much. The reality? You're exactly enough. The universe has been waiting not for you to change, but for you to remember who you've always been. The question isn't whether you're different. The question is, what will you do with your magnificence? Your time of hiding is over. Your era of becoming has begun.